You have never rooted for the hero as hard as you have rooted for the villain, and somewhere deep inside, that terrifies you. Think about the last time a story truly gripped you, not just entertained you, but reached into your chest and pulled something out. Chances are it wasn't the noble hero standing in the light that made your pulse quicken. It was the one standing in the shadows, speaking truths nobody else dared to say, refusing to bow, refusing to apologize for existing with full force. There is something in the villain that calls to us. And before you dismiss that as a dark flaw in your character, I want you to consider a more unsettling possibility. Maybe the villain isn't showing you your worst self. Maybe they're showing you your most honest one. We live in a world obsessed with heroes. From the time we are children, we are handed a script. Be good, be kind, follow the rules, sacrifice yourself for others, suppress the parts of you that are too loud, too hungry, too complicated, and most of us, most of the time, comply. We smooth ourselves down. We fit ourselves into boxes. We learn to smile at people who diminish us, to stay quiet when we should scream, to shrink when we were built to expand. We become very, very good at performing goodness, while quietly suffocating inside. And then a villain walks onto the screen, or onto the page, and something wakes up. Walter White looks into the camera and says, "He is the one who knocks." Hannibal Lecter speaks with more elegance and self-possession than any saint you've ever seen. Cersei Lannister plays the game of power without apology. Magneto, raised through the worst horrors humanity can produce, looks at a world that tried to destroy him and says, "Never again." And you feel it, that electric recognition, not because you want to do what they do, but because they are doing what a part of you has always wanted to do. Refuse, insist, take up space without permission. Carl Jung, the great Swiss psychologist, had a name for the parts of ourselves we exile. He called it the shadow, not the evil self, but the rejected self. Every quality you were told was too much, too dark, too selfish, too bold. It didn't disappear. It went underground. It gathered in the dark, waiting. And here is the remarkable thing Jung discovered. The more violently we deny the shadow, the more power it gains over us. The more desperately we perform goodness on the surface, the more the exiled parts of us hunger for expression. We don't get rid of those parts by hiding them. We just make them dangerous. The villain in almost every story that resonates deeply is not random. They are not chaos for chaos's sake. They are a person who refused to exile their shadow, who looked at the rules of the world and decided, consciously or not, that those rules were designed by people who benefited from their compliance. And whether their response is horrifying or heroic, something about that refusal speaks to the buried parts of every human being who has ever been asked to make themselves smaller to make someone else comfortable. This is why the most memorable villains are never purely evil. They are always right about something. Thanos genuinely believes he is saving the universe. Killmonger has seen the real wounds of history and is responding to actual injustice. The Joker, in his most terrifying version, is pointing at the absurdity of a society that only values people for their utility. We hate them. We are fascinated by them because we cannot entirely dismiss them. Now ask yourself this, and sit with the discomfort of the question, what parts of your own truth have you been performing as a villain in your own inner story? Because here is what nobody tells you about the hero and the villain dynamic. We don't just see it on screens. We live it inside ourselves. Every time you feel a surge of real, unapologetic desire, for power, for recognition, for something more than the life you've been handed, and then immediately shame yourself for it, you are casting that desire as your inner villain. Every time ambition rises in you and you call it greed, every time anger rises and you call it sin, every time loneliness cries out for more than you have been given and you call it neediness, you are not fighting darkness. You are fighting yourself, and you are losing in slow motion. Philosophers have wrestled with this for centuries. Nietzsche, who understood the villain archetype better than almost anyone, spoke of what he called the will to power, not the desire to dominate others, but the drive to become more fully yourself, to stop living by values inherited from a culture that needs your submission and start forging values that serve your actual becoming. He watched Christianity, morality, and social convention and saw something brilliant and sinister at once, a system that turns weakness into virtue and calls it holiness. That tells the strong to kneel, the bold to whisper, the vital to become meek, and frames this as the highest good. Nietzsche wasn't endorsing cruelty. He was diagnosing a disease. The disease of people who have been so thoroughly taught to suppress their vitality that they've begun to celebrate the suppression itself. The villain, in this light, is not evil. The villain is the person who survived the suppression, but without wisdom. They became free of the cage, but without knowing what to do with freedom, and that distinction matters enormously. If that idea has already begun to resonate somewhere in you, if you're starting to see yourself in these mirrors, stay with me, because what comes next might be the most important thing you've considered in a long time. Subscribe so you don't lose this thread when it gets to the part that changes things. Every great story has a moment when the villain and the hero are revealed to be two versions of the same being. Think of Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker. Father and son, the same force flowing through both, only channeled differently. Think of Professor X and Magneto, two men who endured the same wound and drew opposite conclusions. The villain is not the opposite of the hero. The villain is the hero who was not held properly, the hero who was not given the tools to transform pain into purpose, who had all the same gifts, all the same fire, all the same hunger for justice or meaning, but who, at the critical moment, lacked something. Not courage, not power, often just someone who believed in them before they believed in themselves. And this is where the story becomes personal, because every person reading this has both of them inside. The version of you that learned to carry your wounds into wisdom, and the version that almost let your wounds harden into armor and then into a weapon. Most of us have lived both. Most of us have had seasons where we became a villain in someone else's story, not out of malice but out of unprocessed pain looking for the nearest exit. And most of us have also had moments of genuine heroism that nobody witnessed, that were never applauded, that cost us something real. The question is not whether you have a shadow. The question is whether you are willing to look at it clearly. Because here is the secret that almost nobody teaches. The path to becoming fully yourself does not run around the shadow. It runs through it. The integration of your exiled self, the fierce parts, the hungry parts, the parts that refuse to be small, is not a moral failure. It is the actual work of becoming a whole human being. Jung called it individuation. The mystics called it dark night of the soul. The storytellers have been calling it the villain's arc. For as long as stories have existed, the greatest character transformations in all of fiction are not the heroes who start good and stay good. They are the ones who descend and who touch their own darkness and come back changed. Zuko in Avatar, Jaime Lannister before the story broke him apart and put him back wrong. Even Scrooge, who had to become a ghost story to remember how to be human. They had to face what they had buried. They had to let the villain they were becoming speak. And then, only then, did they find their way back to something real. But there is a secret even deeper than that, and very few people are willing to hear it. The villain you most admire is not showing you who you could become if you lost your morality. They are showing you what you are already carrying but have not yet claimed, the ruthless competence of a Hannibal Lecter. That is your mind, hungry to be fully used, the magnetic refusal to bow that you love in every great anti-hero. That is your sovereignty still waiting to be lived, the dark charisma that pulls people toward a villain against their will. That is your authentic presence, unexpressed, finding the only outlet you've allowed it, vicarious admiration from a safe distance. You are not watching the villain. You are watching the parts of yourself you haven't given permission to exist yet. And the greatest tragedy is not becoming a villain. The greatest tragedy is spending an entire life admiring what you could have been through the borrowed lives of fictional monsters, because you were too afraid to integrate your own wildness, your own power, your own sacred refusal to be less than you are. Here is where everything lands. You were not born good and you were not born evil. You were born whole, and then the world began the long work of separating you from yourself. It told you which parts were acceptable and which were shameful. It handed you a costume and called it a soul, and you wore it so long, you forgot there was something underneath. The villain reminds you, not because you should become one, but because in their refusal, in their hunger, in their unbroken will, you glimpse, for just a moment, something that was yours before the world got hold of you. The work is not to become the villain. The work is to take back what the villain is holding for you, to look at that fire and say, that's mine, that ambition is mine, that refusal to disappear is mine, that voice that will not be silenced is mine, and then to carry it with the wisdom and love the villain was never given. That is the arc no one tells you about. Not hero, not villain, but the person who was brave enough to be both and chose, consciously, how to live. If this journey has opened something in you today, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below with the villain that has always spoken to something deep in you. I want to know. And I think you'll surprise yourself with the answer. Like this video if it found you at the right moment. Subscribe because this is only the beginning of what we're going to explore together. The most dangerous thing in the world is a person who finally knows themselves completely. Become that person.